One word ended a presidency's strongest attack in under 30 seconds. Not a legal brief, not a press conference, one word. And the most powerful government on the planet has not recovered from it since. The mainstream media covered this as a diplomatic spat, a trade disagreement that got heated, two leaders who don't particularly like each other, another bad week for transatlantic relations. That framing is not just wrong, it is precisely the framing that prevents you from understanding what actually happened. Because what happened here was not a spat, it was a demonstration. A live, globally broadcast proof of concept for how power actually works when one side has the facts and the other has only volume. Here is what nobody is telling you. The most dangerous thing you can do to a powerful person is give them exactly what they ask for. Let's start with the moment itself, because the sequence is everything. A formal White House briefing. International press in full attendance. Cameras live across every major network. This was not a campaign rally, not a leaked private call, not an off-the-cuff remark to a friendly journalist. This was the official, scheduled, on-record public position of the United States government, delivered from behind the seal of the presidency, flanked by the flags of two nations that have shared a border, a defense alliance, and an economic relationship for longer than most countries have existed in their current form. And from that podium, the President of the United States called the Prime Minister of Canada a liar. Not once, not as a slip, 5 times, deliberate, specific, on camera, to the world. The accusation was precise. Mark Carney had lied about trade data, the bilateral deficit figures he had cited publicly, the goods balance, the services balance, the depth of energy integration, the architecture of the shared supply chain were fabricated, made up. The Canadian Prime Minister, the President said 5 times, had invented economic statistics to make Canada appear indispensable when it was not. That is a remarkable accusation. Not because it is harsh. Political language is often harsh. It is remarkable because of what it required to be true. For the accusation to hold, Carney would have had to invent numbers and hope that nobody checked. He would have had to fabricate statistics and cite them publicly in front of journalists who cover this beat professionally. He would have had to do this knowing that every trade figure he mentioned was cross-referenceable against public databases maintained by multiple independent agencies, including the agencies of the United States federal government itself. That was the bet the accusation required, and it was the wrong bet, because the figures Carney had cited did not come from a Canadian government document. They did not come from a sympathetic think tank, a friendly academic, or a research institution with a political orientation. They came from the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, from the United States International Trade Commission, from the United States Department of Commerce, published, publicly available, taxpayer-funded, updated within the previous 90 days. Official statistical output of the administration that had just called him a liar. Carney had not cherry-picked. He had not misread. He had quoted the president's own government back to the president accurately and been called a liar 5 times on camera for doing it. What followed in diplomatic circles was swift and it was severe. Former ambassadors reached for historical comparisons and found almost none. Allied governments issued statements that translated from the careful language of institutional diplomacy into direct English said the same thing. A line had been crossed that no Western leader had crossed in the post-war period. France expressed what it diplomatically called grave concern. Germany said the language fell beneath the standards expected within the alliance. Japan issued what analysts described as its sharpest public rebuke directed at a sitting American president since 1945. But the concern from Allied capitals was not purely about Canada. The trade figures were almost beside the point. What moved through foreign ministries on 4 continents was a structural question. If the President of the United States was willing to stand at the White House podium and call a friendly Democratic leader a liar on camera formally, 5 times for accurately citing verified American government statistics, what was the limiting principle? What would stop the same accusation from being leveled at the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of France, any Allied leader who ever cited data inconvenient to a preferred political narrative? The invisible architecture that makes diplomatic relationships functional, the assumed good faith The understood boundary between policy disagreement and personal attack, the norm that even adversaries do not publicly question each other's basic honesty without cause, that architecture was not strained, it was dismantled on live television before every newsroom on earth. And then the world waited for the response. Here is what the world expected. The consensus among diplomatic correspondents, political analysts, veteran communications professionals, and foreign policy commentators was unanimous. A substantial, documented, multi-layered rebuttal, a press conference with source documents displayed, a panel of economists, charts, citations traced to their origin in real time. Some predicted harder measures, economic countermoves, tariff responses, the suspension of bilateral working groups, the recall of senior diplomatic personnel. The universal assumption was that the severity of the accusation demanded a proportional response, and proportional meant long, visible, and backed by machinery. Nobody predicted what actually came. No visual aids, no expert witnesses, no panel, no press conference with a structured agenda, no stack of folders. Just a man, a single sheet of paper, a podium in Ottawa, and 30 seconds. What happened behind that decision is as important as the decision itself. Carney's communications team had in fact prepared exactly what the world expected: a 15-minute response, sourced, verified, methodical, a forensic dismantling of every element of the accusation with every figure traced to its published origin, airtight, thorough, correct in every detail. Carney read it in full, set it down, and said, according to multiple people present in the room, something that has since become the analytical core of how this entire episode is being studied. If I need 15 minutes to prove I am not a liar, I have already lost. The truth does not require 15 minutes. Give me 30 seconds. His staff argued against it. They said the global audience expected documented weight. They warned that brevity would read as having nothing to say. Carney listened, and then he walked to the podium. Let's go through what happened in those 30 seconds carefully, because each element is structurally precise. He stepped up alone, one sheet of paper, no rearranged staging, no altered lighting, no support staff flanking him, a man, a document, a camera. He began by doing something almost every communications professional would advise against in this situation. He repeated the accusation in his own voice. The President of the United States called me a liar today. 2 seconds of silence. He did not look away. He did not adjust his notes. He let the words sit in the air, but now under his control, placed on his terms, stripped of the original framing and redeployed in a context he owned entirely. Then he named the specific charge, that the figures he had cited on goods, on services, on energy, on supply chain were fabricated. He held up the single sheet of paper. This is the relevant data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, and the Department of Commerce, all published within the last 90 days. It confirms on every metric I cited exactly what I said. He lowered the paper, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, without a single theatrical gesture, he delivered the sequence that has since been replayed across every platform on Earth more times than anyone has counted. So either the president did not read his own government's data before calling me a liar, 1 second of silence, or he did read it and called me a liar anyway, 2 seconds of silence. He let that binary land without assistance. He did not explain it. He did not soften it. He did not offer a third interpretation. There were 2 options and 2 options only. The audience's mind was given exactly those 2 paths, and both of them led to the same destination. Either the president was uninformed or the president was dishonest. There was no exit built into the structure of those 2 sentences. Carney had not built one in. The trap required no lock because it had no door. Then he looked directly into the camera. 5 words. The word he is looking for is mirror. He closed the folder. He nodded once. He stepped back. He left the room. 30 seconds. The silence in the Ottawa room lasted 4 full seconds before it broke. Journalists reaching for phones, producers into headsets, the sound of a story landing in real time. Within 15 minutes, the clip was airing complete and unedited on every major network. Nothing needed to be trimmed, nothing needed to be contextualized. The response was its own explanation. Within an hour, the word mirror was trending globally. Within 3 hours, it had been translated into 46 languages and shared hundreds of millions of times across every major platform. A single diplomatic word had entered the political vocabulary of the planet faster than any statement in the history of modern media. And the reason it worked, the reason 30 seconds defeated what would have been a 15-minute rebuttal, is encoded in the architecture of those 30 seconds. Repeating the accusation in his own voice was not a mistake. It was ownership. He did not flinch from the word liar. He placed it on his terms before a single rebuttal had been offered. He neutralized the president's framing by absorbing it and redeploying it. The single sheet of paper was not merely evidence. It was a signal about the nature of the evidence. The proof was so clear, so direct, so unambiguous that it required no binder, no team, no supporting apparatus, one page from the president's own government. The simplicity of the physical object communicated something that no amount of additional documentation could have communicated. This is not complicated. The binary gave every person watching exactly two conclusions and closed every exit. It is structurally identical to a proof by exhaustion and formal logic. You eliminate every possibility except the ones that remain. The ones that remained were both damaging, both equally. There was no neutral ground to retreat to, and the mirror line delivered the final movement. Not a counterattack, not a returned insult, a redirection, a statement that the weapon the president had deployed, the word liar, described not the person it had been aimed at, but the person who had aimed it. Look in the mirror, you will find what you are describing. Now let's talk about Washington's response, because the institutional reaction in the days that followed is as revealing as the 30 seconds themselves. The White House press secretary held a briefing 2 hours after the clip aired. She was immediately asked the question that Carney's binary had made structurally inescapable. The prime minister cited data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, and the Department of Commerce. Does the president dispute his own government's data? There is no safe answer to that question. There was never a safe answer to that question. Answering yes would mean publicly acknowledging that the president was contradicting the official statistical output of his own administration, an admission of internal institutional incoherence that would raise questions far beyond the Canada-trade relationship. Answering no would mean acknowledging that the data was accurate and therefore that the president had called a foreign leader a liar for accurately stating verified facts produced by the United States government itself. The press secretary could not navigate the trap because the trap had no navigable exit. The resulting footage, a senior White House official visibly unable to answer a direct yes or no question, was clipped and shared nearly as widely as Carney's original 30 seconds. Republican strategists speaking privately acknowledged the structural problem immediately. The administration had been outmaneuvered by a 30-second clip built from its own government's data. A long counter-response draws attention back to the original exchange and reads as defensive. A short response accomplishes nothing against a clip that has already been seen by hundreds of millions of people. Ignoring it concedes the point without contest. Carney had constructed a response with no winning countermove available, and he had done it in less time than a television commercial. And then the polling came in. Within 5 days of the exchange, surveys showed that 63% of Americans, including 41% of self-identified Republicans, rated Carney's response as effective or very effective. 57% said that the use of American government data specifically undermined the original accusation. And when asked directly who they found more credible in the exchange, 52% of all respondents chose the Canadian Prime Minister over their own president. Among independent voters, that number rose to 61%. Among voters under 35, it reached 68%. A generation that has grown up inside unprecedented informational noise, that has developed a finely calibrated ability to distinguish weight from volume, rendered its verdict clearly. One man had looked certain, the other had sounded loud, and people can tell the difference. Within 1 week, 2 allied foreign ministries had formally requested briefings from Ottawa. Not about the substance of the trade dispute, not about the policy positions, about the communication strategy itself. How do you prepare a 30-second response? How do you identify the single document that proves the case? How do you construct a binary argument with no available exit? How do you find the one word that redirects without counterattacking? A professor of political communication at one of Europe's leading universities announced that the clip would be added to her graduate curriculum, the first time a diplomatic exchange had been added to that program in 30 years, not because of who the participants were, but because of what it demonstrated with a structural clarity that required no annotation. One European diplomat speaking to a major financial newspaper said something that has been quoted in political science departments and boardrooms in equal measure since. He said, "Canada just wrote the manual, and the manual is 30 seconds long. Here is the principle at the core of all of this, the one that extends furthest beyond this specific trade dispute and these specific leaders and this specific political moment." The president deployed the bluntest word in political language, liar, expecting it to function as a weapon. The short-term logic was straightforward and not unreasonable. A severe enough accusation forces the accused to spend their energy on defense. Time spent defending is time not spent attacking. The accused is positioned reactively. The accuser controls the terrain of the exchange. That is the theory of political combat that has governed public communication for decades. What Carney's 30 seconds demonstrated is precisely why that theory fails under a specific and verifiable condition. When the accusation is not only false but provably false using the accuser's own evidence, the accusation does not place the accused on the back foot, it hands the accused a weapon. The only remaining question is whether the accused is disciplined enough to use it with precision rather than volume. Carney was disciplined enough. He resisted the 15-minute rebuttal. He resisted the press conference with charts. He resisted every instrument of modern political communication that would have done what political communication almost always does: generate more words, more noise, more content for a cycle that was already saturated. He understood that the most powerful available move was to say less, to say precisely enough, to say it once clearly, and then leave the room. And that is what the White House still cannot answer. Not because the administration lacks resources or communications capacity, not because the most powerful government on earth is incapable of mounting a response, but because the specific structure of those 30 seconds made a complete response logically impossible. You cannot dispute data produced by your own government without creating a more damaging story than the one you are trying to contain. You cannot ignore a binary that the public has already absorbed and already answered in their own minds. You cannot outbrief a 30-second clip with a 20-minute press conference because the disparity in length becomes its own editorial comment on the relative confidence of each position. The word mirror remains unanswered, not because no one has tried, but because answering it requires acknowledging what the question contains, that the accusation delivered 5 times at a White House podium described not the man it was aimed at, but the man who aimed it. Here is what this exchange actually revealed and why it is being studied far beyond the news cycle that contained it. For decades, political communication has operated on an assumption so widespread it has become invisible that volume is authority, that the loudest voice, the most repeated claim, the most comprehensively staffed rebuttal operation is the most powerful, that winning a public argument means producing more content, more evidence, more surrogates, more presence across every available medium. Carney's 30 seconds did not merely challenge that assumption, they falsified it in real time in front of every newsroom on earth with 1 page of data and 1 word. The quietest voice in that exchange belonged to the man who had been called a liar 5 times. The most powerful argument was the one that took the least time to make. The most devastating response was the one that did not respond at all in the conventional sense, that did not rebut, did not argue, did not defend, but simply held up a mirror and said, "Look at what you are describing, because what you are describing is yourself." In a world that has spent years drowning in escalating political volume, in the permanent acceleration of the news cycle, in the assumption that whoever speaks longest and loudest must have the most to say, a man stood at a podium for 30 seconds with 1 piece of paper and 5 words and proved the opposite. He proved that the strongest position requires the fewest words to state. He proved that the most credible voice is the one that knows precisely when to stop. He proved that when the facts are unambiguous, the argument is already made before the first word is spoken. And he proved that the most powerful thing any communicator can do is often not what they choose to include, but everything they choose to leave out. The word is mirror. Washington has not answered it. The silence is the answer.